Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 40 with Travis Henderson. Travis Henderson is a VFX artist at Heart Machine Studios. He has worked on titles like Darksiders, Chronos, and Dead and Buried. Travis has been working in the field of visual effects for over 5 years, creating eye-catching effects across the universe with Unreal Engine, Unity for both PC, console, and even virtual reality environments.
Welcome to the Real-Time Visual Effects Podcast, the place to hear from some of the video game industry's most seasoned artists and up your game. Listen in on how you can learn and grow as a VFX artist, discover your own wizard, and network with hundreds of other talented magicians in the real-time visual effects community. Here is your host, Travis McCallum.
Travis, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about yourself? It's great to finally be here.
It is still hot as heck here in Dallas, Texas. I am ready for fall and winter to come.
You mean mid-70s?
Where the pumpkin season really kicks in.
Yep.
Hey man, I want to talk about some of these awesome effects that you've been working on, but I want to start with your origin story and learn how the heck did you get started in visual effects?
Pretty much stumbled upon it, almost literally. I first found out about it when I was at GDC. I want to say my first time there. I think I was like 2 years into college at that point, or I guess 4-year college, actually pursuing like game dev art. I was wandering around, I think it was Friday. I had nothing else I wanted to do that day, but my pass still got me into a bunch of stuff. I think I had like the indie gamer pass or like the indie game designer pass, which got me into more stuff than the expo. So I had sat in on a bunch of stuff like Monday, Tuesday, and then there was like the crowd of people Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. But I was like, what is on here? I have a gap. And there was the VFX Artist roundtable, and it was like the last day they were doing it. I was like, that sounds neat. So I walked over and got a shout out the random conference associate who helped me out. Without them, I may not be doing VFX, but he wasn't sure if my pass actually allowed me to get in there. And I think there was an error with the little scanner thingy he had. So he's like, you know what? If there's room, go ahead and sit in there. And he let me go in. I think a couple years later when I tried, they're like, oh yeah, your pass doesn't get you in for that. So just on happen chance, sat in on the VFX Artist roundtable. I was like, listening to everyone talk, I'm like, okay, this is really cool. Didn't know where to take it from there though. And when that got out, David Johnson, everyone knows him as DJ, and he was very kind enough to give me a moment of his time and explain, he elaborated a little bit more on what VFX were, pointing me to where I could get a start, and very thankful to him. I think he was already late for like another talk and he still stopped and gave me, a good amount of his time to answer all my questions. And from there, I found ImbueFX and did all of those tutorials, all the videos, bought all the programs. So shout out to Bill for doing all of that. I think he's gotten so many people started on VFX more than he even realizes. Did that, did self-learning for that for about a year or so, and then randomly stumbled on an opening for a junior effects artist position, and that was at Gunfire Games, and that was my first job.
That's awesome, man. So video games, you'd mentioned that you're in the game dev program when you started at school. Did you always know, I was going to go work in games? And what was that, trigger point where it's like, this is where I see my future?
When I picked up a Game Boy, I knew that's what I wanted to do when I was 8 or 9 years old. I remember I was playing it and be like, I'm going to be the first one to make a Harry Potter game, because that was right when the books came out too. It was it's going to have all kinds of spells. Yeah, being 8 years old, no one's going to think of that before me by the time, I'm old enough to know how to do all this. Totally, yeah, it's super realistic. But yeah, I don't know. My Game Boy Color, I think, was the first gaming system I had. And I think the first time I actually played video games and what I wanted to do. But I honestly had no clue where to go from there other than just drawing until I think 2 years into college. I didn't know, there wasn't a lot of information on different roles in game development. I kid you not, I thought the two people who made games were the artists who did all of the paintings and made the art, and programming. That was it. When I saw 3D animations and stuff, I thought there was a programmer hand coding every triangle and how it moved, and I was like, okay, I can't do programming. And I attempted that several times and it did not go well. But there wasn't that much information. I didn't know there were designers or animators or 3D modeling programs. I just remember taking a programming class in high school. I was like, oh man, it took all that lines of code to make a blue triangle and have it spin. I was like, oof, what about these characters? And then 2 years into junior college, I stumbled on like an intro to 3D modeling course in Maya, and that was like where the door completely opened. I was like, oh, there's a whole bunch of this that I didn't even realize contributed to it. I love 3D modeling, but like I didn't know there were 3D models. Like I didn't know there was rigging and animation and stuff like that. Like not even until later I knew there was like game designers and people who scripted things. Hopefully there's a lot more information out there now, and people have more access to that and know what all these rules are. I know Riot put out like the whole mini video series of like what goes into making a game. So hopefully resources like that help kids and other people like find this sooner in life and figure out where they want to go from that. Because I did. So when I transferred from junior college, I think I started doing character art. Like I really loved modeling characters, but I mean, I wasn't good at it. It was like, I had touched Maya for, a couple years before that. So was just kind of stumbling around in it. So hopefully people find what they like to do sooner and have a lot more resources to get started and be able to make what they want to make earlier on.
For sure, for sure. Can you tell me about one of your favorite projects that you've been able to work on for visual effects?
They're definitely not my favorite effects, but I think my favorite project is still the very first one I worked on, which was Chronos I think it was an Oculus launch title. And I don't know, like the stars just aligned for that game. It was so much fun to work on. The scope for creating it was very reasonable. It's like they knew like this is exactly what we want to make. There was some feature creep, you always get the, hey, it'd be cool if kind of things in game dev, but I don't think anyone was really crunching on that. I could have been oblivious to how long other people were working. The scope was very well contained. It was so much fun to work on. It was my first introduction to VR, and the way they had set up VR was you had a fixed camera. I know a lot of people probably aren't familiar with the game, but it was old school Resident Evil style where you had a fixed camera position when you entered a room. So you're still moving around. You have like a third person character that you're controlling and moving around in space. But each room you go to, your camera is in a set location. It doesn't follow. You can't move it around. That's just where you are. But then you had the VR aspect where you could actually like from that position, like look behind you and look up and down. And it was a great introduction to VR. And, the level design and all the environment art was so fantastic that like each room you like walked into, you're just like, ooh, like this is really cool. There was one that started you on the edge of this tower, like where the camera was over this wooden platform, and you could just look down and it was just abyss. Like it goes down just like into the fog plane or whatever, and you look up, it was just open sky with some birds flying by, and you could just see the tower just like going up into the clouds. So it was really spectacular, and I think that really stuck with me. The gameplay was really fun. Like whenever we were testing it, it was always fun to play. The effects, I don't want to say were minimal, but it wasn't like super over the top. It wasn't like Darksiders when I worked on that, where just like turn everything up to 11, make it bright and flashy. It was a lot of subtle stuff, and I think that was also a good learning experience for me, starting from toned down and then working my way up to, all the over the top flashy stuff, because it was like, here's some dust falling when you open a door, like there's idle leaves falling off a tree, sparks flying off a shield when it gets hit, stuff like that. I think that was a good starting point as a learning experience.
I really value those more traditional or ambient effects that go into games because they bring together like the believability. And I was recently seeing somebody post, every time I get a reel from a VFX candidate, it's all flashy spells. Whatever happened to the days when I got a reel that was not just spells? And it's nice to hear you have that as an intro or warm up to kind of like build the foundations of observation of like the natural world was, and then kind of grow from that experience.
And I think it's something a lot of newer VFX artists starting out don't consider. You're not going to notice them when they're there, but you'll notice them if they're not there, kind of thing. And it also being on in VR, like we couldn't do a whole bunch. We couldn't do layers and layers of flashy stuff. Like we had to tone it down for performance reasons. And I think that's what a good amount of beginning VFX artists are going to be doing when they get their first job, if they're not going to be, working on something like League where it's all just like abilities, spells, flash. For pretty much every other kind of game, they're probably going to be doing the foot splashes for characters when they run through water. They're going to be doing, the dust puffs. It is very hard to do, and it's a good jumping off point to master like the flash and the layering of elements and stuff like that. But I think a lot of these artists are going to get to a studio, especially one like a AAA studio that has more realistic effects, where like you're going to be doing water splashes on rocks for rivers and all this other kinds of stuff. So starting from that and, having that being the baseline of my expectation and being able to move up from there, I think was a good experience.
Now, you've been in the field for a little over 5 years now. What do you think some of the big trends are happening in the visual effects industry for 2021?
Actually, it'll be 6 years in a week and a half. So,
Woohoo.
God, I feel like I've been doing this simultaneously forever, and I feel like I just got here. I don't know if that's just like the imposter syndrome or just the paradox that everyone else deals with, but I'm just like, I've been doing this forever. I haven't been doing this long enough to tell anyone anything. Trends for 2021. I think with the really great success of VFX Apprentice, and I think just as a general trend for games, we're going to see a lot of more handcrafted, stylized effects across a lot of games, trying to get that hand-painted feel for more like third-person style games, not just like top-down MOBAs and stuff like that. I think that's about it. That's the only direction I can see VFX trending as sort of like an art direction, because it doesn't seem to be trending in very many other places, which I guess follows up into the next question.
Yeah, what do you think is one of the biggest challenges that VFX is facing right now?
I think a big one that I actually didn't consider until I saw someone respond about it on LinkedIn is with the ease of access for learning more stylized, flashy, colorful VFX. A lot of people are using those as a jumping off point and learning those, and they want to do those as well because they're fun to do. But I think we're going to start seeing a shortage of real-time VFX artists who can and want to do realistic effects, because it seems like everyone wants to make the flashy league style stuff. And I mean, I'm in that same boat. Like for me, I don't enjoy doing realistic stuff because every game, every effect, it feels like you're reinventing the wheel. And I mentioned this in my comment on there, like you can only do an explosion so many times. Like your color palette is limited to yellows and oranges and browns and grays for dust and debris and stuff. You have sparks, you have fire, you have explosions. So, and then a couple of other people have mentioned that the people who do know these realistic style of effects are coming from TV or film, and they don't have those real-time skills to transfer that into a game engine. And it's difficult to hire them, or you can't hire them because you don't have the studio or the other effects artists don't have the bandwidth to teach them how to transfer that into real time, because it's night and day. It's not even apples and oranges, it's like apples and broccoli. Like it's still food, but they're completely different. So yeah, real-time realistic effects artists, a shortage of those. And then another thing I kind of feel like we're falling behind on, and it's not us as artists so much as maybe the industry as a whole, is it feels like we're getting fewer advances for what effects artists can do in an engine versus other areas of real-time art. Like for instance, Nanite in Unreal 5, like that's huge. Like the amount of polys they can put on the screen and how it dynamically, LODs itself and transitions, and being able to use higher res textures for those because they can LOD those out and bounce between different ones, or just throw it in there with poly paint and color everything with vertex paint. Like that is huge. But I mean, effects got Lumen, which you may not even want on. It's basically like the filmic tone mapper in Unreal. You're like, this is great, but I'm doing something stylized. Like I don't want it to wash out and have like this white color and this harsh bloom. Like I want to be able to have more control over that, and it's really hard to do. I feel like that's going to be the same thing with Lumen. Like, cool, that may benefit some more realistic style effects, but in terms of other VFX art, that's not as helpful. I think they're doing some stuff with realistic fluid sims, and I mean, I'm sure that'll be helpful for some things, but we're still limited to flipbooks. We're still limited in our texture size because those are always loaded in there. Like, those can't LOD as aggressively as environment textures, because then the effect as a whole breaks down, like your flipbook breaks down or your noise texture starts to break down, and that's a lot more noticeable farther away. So I feel like we are getting new tools, but we're not getting them at the rate and at the advancement of other areas of game dev art.
From your own philosophy on visual effects, what do you feel like our biggest contribution to the games or the movies or the projects that we work on as part of a team is? What's the role of visual effects in everything we do?
I feel like we either ground something in believability with those, the subtle ambient effects that you're not going to notice them if they're there, but you'll notice if they're not there. I feel like it's like a kind of a glue that holds at least the art side of that together. You're blending the environment together with the character. And I feel like we add some level of excitement to it. Like you can have the most flashy finishing animation in a game, but if there's no effects for that, like that tones it down to, half the cool factor. So I think we contribute a lot in the wow factor of games and the believability of art in games.
Now, you've been working with a lot of FX artists across different companies. I was curious, what are some of the things that you're looking at in the art you see, even on Discord with, the forums, that really kind of tells you how an effect can be good to great? What are some of those key indicators?
I mean, the first thing I always look for in anyone else's work is like, what can I learn from this? Trying to figure out what techniques they used, how they used them, looking at it really closely, because I'm really bad at starting out in VR was a good learning experience, but that also kept me from adding a lot of additional layers to my effects. So I'm always looking at other people, like the tiny details and the extra glows and stuff that people are adding to theirs, because I don't feel like I'm very strong at layering my effects with different elements. And then I guess I just look at how it feels as a whole. And I hated that response and that sort of word or that phrase feels when I first started out, because it's not something you can quantify. Like, it's not something teachable. It's just something you kind of, I guess, gain in the back of your brain over experience. But I look for, how does this effect feel? Does it feel good? And I mean, I don't think we have enough time in this podcast for me to elaborate and try and put that in terms of like being quantifiable to a point where a new artist can utilize that and use it to learn, hey, what can I learn from this? And how does the effect feel when I'm looking at other people's stuff? And how does it differ from mine? Like, does this feel better than mine? Why does it feel better than mine? And I try and just wring as much information out of other people's effects as I possibly can to improve, and then share anything that I've learned with other people so that, they don't have to spend 10 hours, studying something or banging their head against the wall for something. It's like, I went through that. Like, you shouldn't have to. Like, here's how I did that.
So your present day Travis, 2021, you can go back in the past to old past Travis. What kind of advice would you have given him?
Oh, focus on timing. It's just like drawing. You don't want to sit there and do, gesture drawings, and you don't want to do figure studies because that you feel like that's boring. You just want to jump straight into, the League splash art or that really dynamic comic book panel of the brightly colored superhero. Like, you just want to go straight into that. But a lot of stuff you will notice if timing is bad. And I think it's a lot easier to learn that and get a feel for that when you're not also trying to throw the kitchen sink at your effects too. I'd like to at some point. I know there's a couple videos out there, but I wanted to do one on timing and show like the kind of curves that I use, and just doing it on like a simple sphere. Like, here's, different ease in and ease out that looks good or that I use a lot, and then show the, the size by life animation curve or the color over life. Be like, this is, why it feels good, and try and stress that there is a lot of merit to just, using particle spheres and gradients to just practice animating those over and over for your effects. And then another thing I wish I would have learned was, don't try to do everything all at once for your effect. It takes you so much more time. You keep going back and you're like, well, now this is out of sync and now I need to fix the timing on this. You can probably cut that time by a quarter, even half, if you're like, here's the big chunk, not worrying about, getting the size by life and the color over life perfect. You just want the largest chunks first, do your large beats, like get it that general feel, and then, okay, this smaller element next, and the smaller element next, and then refining down from large for everything down to the small. So like, okay, I've done my bullet pass. I went my biggest elements to my smallest elements. Going to refine everything for the big one, then refine everything for the medium, then refine everything for the small stuff. So having that process of that step by step in a hierarchy, I'm not sure if that's taught or if there's as much information about that, or I'm sure there's some people who keep screaming this at the ceiling, and they're probably screaming now, be like, I keep telling everyone this, but have been a great thing to learn. Don't fall into the trap of throwing all your time learning materials unless you end up becoming an amazing tech artist, which we need more of as well. Then more power to you. But just as a VFX artist, it's easy to dig in and spend hours and hours and hours learning, shaders and materials. It's a structure where it's like X plus Y equals Z. Like, there is a formula to it, and it's easier to learn off of those kind of formulas. So there's a draw to spending more time learning those kinds of things. But in reality, a lot of the effects that I do, I'm combining textures together. Like, it's adds and multiplies, and then you run that through a color LUT, or you color that with particle color. Like, that is a huge chunk of all the stuff that I do, and all of the material tricks that I use most often are very simple. And then the more advanced stuff has just been sort of tribal knowledge, I guess. It's someone better than me sharing like this, hey, here's how I did this one small thing, or like the micro tutorials you can find on Twitter. It's like, here's how, and you just kind of like those kinds of advanced bits and pieces you can kind of collect. So don't worry about, making the most crazy advanced material, because it's probably not going to be used in a production setting unless, the game director is like, that's awesome, we're going to build around that, which happens very rarely. And you can spend that time either refining your simulation knowledge through something like Embergen, or if you want to do realistic effects, or refining your fundamentals of animation if you want to do more stylized effects for third person and MOBAs, where stuff like that has more impact.
Speaking of what kind of process you go about to create an effect, I know real-time visual effects forums often has these sketch competitions on a month-by-month basis. Mm-hmm. If you were to participate in one of those, like, how would you go about creating your effect?
I guess the idea of what I want to make is probably like the biggest crux of it. It's that pivot point for the idea or the effect, so to speak. Just, hey, what do I want to make? How do I want to go about making it? And thinking about what I would need to do to make said concept come to life. Then starting with bulk assets, what kind of meshes am I going to need? What's my material going to need to do the things that I want it to do? Thankfully, I have a bunch of different ones that I've started making and have in a personal project folder, so I don't have to go back and make that. Most of them do pretty much anything I can think of. And if they don't, I have those available that I can just like copy and paste huge chunks of nodes into whatever I need, and then just trying to put it together and make it look how it looks in my head.
Nice. Any role models that you have inspired or influenced the work or activities that you've done, VFX or not?
A great artist that I worked with was Nick Chambers. I worked with him on Darksiders Genesis, and he's definitely a big role model. Always has an upbeat attitude, huge team player, very easy to work with, great to work with, does great work, is always receptive to people's feedback, and is very good about structuring his feedback in a way that it's easy to apply. He points out all the good stuff without it sounding super harsh, even if it needs to be. So he has a great way of being like, hey, this could be adjusted this way. And you're like, you're not like, oh, screw you, you hate my stuff. You're like, oh, that is a good point. Like, I can change it that way. I didn't see that before. Generally being a great person to work with is why he's a huge role model. Definitely Jason with putting together VFX Apprentice. Love his drive on him wanting to share everything that he knows and help other people learn, and I definitely share that. So definitely a large inspiration on helping the next generation get into VFX and having that really positive attitude of, here's everything I learned, I want to share it with you. And it seems like game devs come in, I guess, 3 sections, but 2 of the major ones are, hey, I struggled with this was difficult, this was difficult for me, I want to teach that to you so you don't have to go through that. And then on the other side of the coin is, well, I had to do it the hard way, so you have to too. It's a good learning experience. So I think there's 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. And then there's everyone in the middle who's just kind of like a mix of both, or maybe neutral. And then I guess for the non-game dev role models, a guy named Jocko Willink is a pretty big one. He has a podcast. It's more structured around like other people's military experience because he was a Navy SEAL. But one of the big things he kind of preaches is discipline, and how, the excuses you have in your head aren't actually valid for a lot of stuff. So trying to take a key from that and saying, hey, I don't actually need to sleep in. Like, I don't need to take a break and watch TV. I'm not actually tired. Like, I just need to do the work. And then another one was Andy Stumpf, and he has been focusing on keeping a neutral tone and trying to hear everyone's perspective and not having an immediate emotional response to everything. And I think that helps both with constructive criticism for like my effects, and just in life in general, like trying to consider everyone around you and not, jumping to conclusions on someone's reaction and stuff. It's not like, hey, yeah, like I instantly know how to do this. It's always going to be a work in progress, but it definitely helps with working when you're in VFX and you need to work with a lot of different people because you're working with designers and animators and tech artists and programmers. So taking time and trying to understand someone's perspective as they're explaining things to you or as you talk things out with them. And yeah, thought I had more.
That's great.
That's right there.
Yeah, that's great. What does a day in the life for Travis look like from sunrise to sunset?
Let's see. Well, I finally am transitioning out of working from early in the morning to actually getting back into the gym and doing stuff. So probably waking up at 6, work out till about 8:30, food. If I have any extra time between when I'm done eating and starting my day at work, which is 11, because I'm on Central Time, but the studio I work with is on West Coast time, so there's a 2-hour time difference. So I work from 11 a.m. to about 8:30 p.m. So I have a good amount of chunk in my morning, and it's so tempting to want to sleep in, but I know I'm not going to want to do stuff after work, so I'm trying to force myself to squeeze it all in. So taking time in the morning for personal art, personal development, going through all the tutorials that I've bought and still haven't opened, things like that. And then at 11, starting work at Heart Machine, eat lunch around 3-ish, and my day around 8. Usually watch like some TV or go out and do some stuff with friends if that's an available activity, which it isn't so much right now. Yeah, and then go to bed.
Is there any kind of mantras or sayings that you tend to reflect on and use as kind of like positive affirmations to kind of help you through your days and keep you in the right mindset? Any quotations that really stick?
I think the two of my biggest that I'm constantly reminding myself is it's not that big of a deal. Whatever it is in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal. And your life is not that hard. And I'm not saying that to you or people listening to this later on. I'm saying like that to me, like there's a lot you can tend to get caught up in, oh man, like this was a tough day, or, this week sucks. But, except for like the 1% of those situations where it's actually not. And you're like, I'm probably doing pretty well. I don't let myself stay in that mindset of, I had a tough day where like, wasn't that tough? Like, this is like when our plumbing broke in our house in October and like we couldn't afford to pay for it until, last month. I mean, that was frustrating, but like in the grand scheme of things, like I still have a roof over my head. I still have food. There's so many more people all across the world that have it so much more difficult, who would literally kill like to be in the position that I'm in. So I always tell myself, hey, this thing that seems like a big deal, it's not. This thing where it feels like life is hard, it's not. So I just tell myself that over and over. And it makes life a lot easier for me. And it's easier to look on the bright side and appreciate what I have.
Travis, I know that VR is a hot topic with a lot of potential. Can you talk me through the mindset of building VR FX and how is it different from non-VR?
I think the biggest thing is the camera and where the camera can go. And I think that's the biggest in the whole of it, because you can like stick your face in an explosion. It doesn't matter where you put, the collision bounds for things. You can still walk around like in your floor space, or even if you're sitting in your chair, and you can look at something like up underneath it, or, if there's a house or like a waterfall or something that you have, like even if there's some kind of blocker, like you can walk over to it or stick your face in it and see behind it, or see it in an angle that traditional like third person and first person cameras you can't do. So trying to construct your effects in a way where as many angles of it hold up and are believable as possible, and also keeping in mind performance, because you're going to have a lot more overdraw issues if something that's supposed to be, like the size of a softball on your screen, they stick their face way into it, and now, all that overdraw is taking up the entire screen. Stuff like that is going to be an issue where you're like, oh, I could do this really cool thing in this corner and make it look really cool, but someone could end up like going over there and it could tank frame rate. I'm not too familiar on what all goes into like performance certification, but that may keep you from hitting cert for launching your game. Stuff like that. It's a lot of meshes or camera facing things. Always, if you can, have a programmer turn off your like HMD roll in Unreal off by default if it isn't already. For people who aren't familiar with that, you can tilt your head side to side when you have a headset on, and the particles will stay locked and they'll actually like twist with you. So if you're like looking at a leaf or something and you're just like, you can see like the explosion like wobbling around if that stuff isn't turned off. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But making it look good from impossible angles and keeping it performance, the biggest things for VR.
People starting out often wonder, what's the best engine to learn VFX? Now, working both in Unity and Unreal, what experience has taught you about working in the engines for production and personal projects?
Both are great engines, and they both have their merits. And I think their merits are because they're on different ends of the spectrum. So Unreal, you have just an overwhelming amount of features and information and things that you feel like you need to learn. But the plus side is all of those things are already made for you. On Unity's end, like, it's very streamlined. It's a super light program. It runs really fast. And the tools, at least straight out of the box, you can get all kinds of plugins and stuff. But they are much more narrow so that you're not worried about, oh my God, I have to learn all this other stuff. Or, did I click on this on accident? Like, what did I do? The effects stuff is much easier to focus on. There's not a whole bunch of other stuff. But at the same time, I find it more difficult from an artist perspective to work on certain things because it's just not there. Like previewing your effects on a character animation, unless something's changed in the last, year, you can't do that like you can in Unreal. Like Unreal, you can have just your animation window opening with the character animation looping, and you can see your effects where they're playing, and you can adjust them, adjust your widget or your positioning or your timing and just watch that play over and over, or you can drag it into a scene and just watch it loop on its own. And that's one of the frustrating things about Unity. It doesn't have that. I'm not a very technically minded person, so things like where I actually have to type out lines of code to script things is very difficult, and I struggle with that. So I like Unreal because blueprints you can't screw up, like you could screw up blueprint nodes, but you're dragging lines into different nodes and it's telling you, yeah, that's not going to work. You could miss a semicolon or a dash or something trying to type in C# and your thing won't work and you won't know why. Or you'll know why and you're just like, I can't believe I missed that. It just depends. Do you want to focus solely on just particle systems and not worry about all that other stuff? Or you like building your own tools? If you're more technically minded and you like scripting stuff, then I'd say Unity would be a little bit better. And if you do have that more artistic side, like actual lines of code and more technical aspects, they're harder for you to grasp, I would say Unreal is a little bit better to learn on, just because it's very artist friendly. Again, I've barely passed 2 programming classes. I failed 2 others, like at the lowest level, and I can script almost anything I need to in Blueprint now, having like just kind of been poking at that and learning at that. And I'm sure I probably could have done the same thing for Unity and actually like scripting out and learning HLSL and stuff, but it would have been a lot more of a time sink and it would have been a lot more difficult for me to learn. If people are still in that mindset of, oh, you use Unity for stylized and Unreal's for... No, that's entirely BS. There are so many games I could point you to where it just looks hand-painted and gorgeous and you're like, no, it was done in Unreal. I think it's just a little bit harder to get the stylized vibe in Unreal, but I would still recommend Unreal that's a couple of settings in the project. So I lean towards Unreal for artist people.
Rock on. Tell me about your time structuring and refining new VFX workflows and pipelines. For somebody that's been brought into a studio and asked to establish new processes for the team, what can you share to help them?
I think the first couple of things I would try and ask around and get set in stone are, what's the goal of the project as a whole? Like, is this a hack and slash? Is it 3D chess style game? The overall design is intended to be, and what kind of things they're trying to accomplish within the game. Like, or do you want a completely procedural weapon system? You want guns that have, different mods that are going to change the bullet types and change the shape and, how the effects look? Or is your character going to get upgrades where the effects need to upgrade with them? Trying to figure those things out early and then coming up with a process on how to meet those requirements or those goals that they're trying to do. Like, are you going to have a dynamic weather system? Are you going to walk into a dungeon and, suddenly everything's red? Stuff like that. It's like, okay, I need a node and some kind of adjustment in my material to hue shift things if everything turns red, or I need to have something that's going to dynamically lower the emissive values for all of the effects when it goes to night, because you need that kind of stuff cranked up for the daytime to be a bit more visible against all of the bright stuff, or maybe you have darker contrasting effects that are going to completely cover up things at night. So trying to understand those large goals, then figuring out how I need to adjust my VFX workflow so that I'm doing more work with less time. I want to be able to adjust and fix, 10 different things by adjusting one parameter instead of going into those 10 effects and adjusting everything manually by hand. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I love that you talked about this communication with the game designers, because sometimes they don't know what visual effects is, and it's important to have that collaboration with various different stakeholders, your animators, your programmers, because visual effects, as you pointed out, touches every place in the company. And I'm so glad you brought that up with the design, because we are part designers as well.
And especially with a lot of working from home or just starting with a new studio in general, you may not have met everybody. The designers may not think to bring that to you or include you in that meeting where they're talking about that kind of stuff, or all of that was figured out before you got there. And, no one thinks to bring it up or explain the level of depth or the goals for 2 years down the future for the game. And you start making things one way and suddenly you're like, oh, I didn't know we were doing this, going to increase my workload a ton to kind of meet it. So communication is always great, and early on, try and either make sure that you are informed or make sure that you're included in those kinds of things, so you can, be there in the room writing. Even if you're just writing down notes, if you're you could be like, hey, I'm not going to say anything or chime in. I just want to have that option to join, and I want to know what I need to write down. Because unless you've been doing this for 20 years and you've been working with VFX artists for 20 years, not everyone knows everything that goes into VFX either. So on a design or an animation end, they may say, hey, we're going to do this. This will be like a week's worth of work and we can get this feature in. But that week's worth of work for them may be a month's worth of work for you. So understanding that early on and being like, hey, I may not be able to hit this, or I'm going to need more time, or hey, if we adjust it, this much, it'll cut my workload in half, or we need to design a system for this and test it early on before I actually start doing, real art for it.
Yeah, and I love my tech artists because they can speed up my workflows so much faster.
They are great to have. You always want more of them.
Now, you've worked extensively in Unreal Engine's blueprints. Tell us what they are and how VFX artists can make effective use of them, and where they may actually learn to master them.
Oh gosh, I'll actually have to look up that last part because there's a couple of good, really, really good resources that helped me. So I may end up looking off my screen and typing away. So blueprints in Unreal, it's a node-based visual scripting system. And people are probably like, well, what's scripting? It's kind of like a more condensed version of coding. It allows you to get information from the game and spawn and call things without having to type out lines of code, and it's easily adjustable. One of the things I really love about Blueprint is it will tell you if you can't do a thing. If you're typing out code, it's not like, yeah, you can't do that. I mean, I'm sure there's probably some kind of interface where it'll highlight it as red, but I mean, there's probably tons of cases where it's just it's not going to be nope, you can't do that, and Blueprints will. They'll be like, sorry, we're not going to compile, or hey, this doesn't belong in here. A lot of times it won't even let you just connect they have little string nodes for people who aren't familiar with Unreal. You're kind of dragging out a little stretchy piece of spaghetti to connect the nodes together, and either it won't connect, it'll just won't go into the little socket, or it'll give you an error and be like, hey, that doesn't go there. So that's super helpful. For VFX, it allows us to handle multiple particle systems all at once, or find ways of turning them off when we want to, especially for things like looping effects. You can, fire your one-shot particle where it starts everything, and then following that up, you have a looping particle system, and then your end particle system. You're not trying to build all of that into one single thing. You can have it in 3, and it's much more flexible to say, hey, here's where it starts, this is where the looping starts, and it can sit there for 10 minutes or 2 seconds, or maybe there's some kind of parameter where it never reaches the loop at all and it just plays the end out effect. So it gives you more control. You can get a little bit more information with blueprints.
Could you give an example of a game place where that may be happening?
Sure. So I think a good one is projectiles, actual projectiles in games. For anyone new who's listening who doesn't already know this, games usually have 2 different types of bullets. There's a physical projectile that's moving through space and updating its position in 3D world space, and then there's the sort of the lasers, the line traces. It's saying, here's the start point, here's my end point, did I hit anything at that end point? And then you typically spawn some kind of beam or emitter, and then there's a texture that's panning across that beam that looks like a bullet. And those are typically used for very fast firing things, like full auto stuff, very small bullets, things like that. But to kind of step backwards, for an actual moving projectile, you can say, hey, I'm firing this projectile. When this fires, play this shooting animation, fire this particle. The particle's location is at the muzzle of the gun. You're either finding the mesh or maybe it's placed in the animation and you're just telling it whether to fire or not. And then your projectile is probably its own blueprint character. So then you have, all of your effects for the projectile itself. You can have a separate particle system for like the trail or the particles that are spawning off of it. And then when that hits, if it hits something or maybe it has a limited lifetime, then that actor dies. And in that blueprint, you can say, hey, did we die? Are we supposed to do something? Are we playing a different effect if we just die in midair versus we actually collided with something? And then you can spawn additional particles off of those, like maybe the particle crushes itself into a black hole if it doesn't hit anything and that blueprint actor has reached the end of its life. Or if you do hit something like, hey, play this other separate particle system that we have stored in this projectile blueprint actor to play like a huge explosion. There may be a separate input. It's probably better to do it programmatically, but it can be in that blueprint where it's like, did we explode in dirt? Did we explode in water? Do we need to play a secondary effect from these lists based on the kind of environment we hit, or if we hit, a sci-fi shield or things like that? So hopefully that answers your question.
That is crazy. Like chaining particle systems on particle systems. That sounds really complex, but super powerful.
And to follow up on your second part. So on YouTube, this person was incredibly helpful for all their tons and tons of blueprint content for Unreal. I hope I pronounced this right. Matthew Wadstein. He has like tons of 5-minute long micro videos on pretty much what every single blueprint node does, how to use it, and with a demonstration of it, like it actually being used in the engine. They're very quick. You can usually find the exact thing that you're looking for. You understand how you can and can't use it, and it's so helpful. It's like each of those is like getting a Lego, and with all those Legos, you can build what you need. So that's incredibly helpful. Thomas Harley on YouTube, it's T Harley VFX. Anyway, he goes over everything from materials to blueprints. They're a little bit longer. They're around like 20 to 30 minutes. But again, great visual demonstration of this is what this thing does. This is how you use it. Here are some problems you may encounter with it. And I think that's a good thing to include in tutorials. Like, this is what happens when it breaks, and here's how you fix it, instead of showing people, the exact perfect way to do things. I think that helps give people additional information. And then probably help if I was actually logged in so I had all the people I was following.
It's okay, man. If you want to get back, we can include those in the show notes.
Okay.
So people can come follow.
Yep. Unreal Engine, the channel on YouTube, has tons of good stuff. And I think one of the best ways that I learned that my program designer friend at Gunfire told me was just start dragging stuff in. Like, I think it's enter, you right click, and just start searching nodes. See what you can plug in and can't plug into. If you drag off of the little, spaghetti thing off of your blueprint, you can see what that will connect to and what you can use it with, and just kind of poking around with it is really helpful. In terms of understanding the logic and flow of things is kind of a different beast in itself, but that usually you can kind of pick that up as you learn stuff.
All right, talk tech with me. I'd love to know about a material function that you are in love with and use often.
Oh, probably my texture combiner one. It's humongous in my material, but basically takes 3 texture inputs and you can combine them in pretty much every way. So do you want to add all 3 together? Do you want to add A to B and then multiply against C? Do you want to multiply A and B and add to C, multiply all 3 together? It has a setting, are you only combining 2 textures? So many effects in general, at least for like stylized hand painted stuff, and my own effects are just combined textures and then you're coloring them. Super handy to click a button, just have all my options. It was always frustrating being like, hey, I want to multiply these 2 textures together and then color them, and then for a separate effect it's like, well, I want to add these 2 together, and then like, oh well, now I want to combine 3 together. Like it just does it all, and I use it a ton. Another really simple one that I use a lot adjusts basically the values of a grayscale texture. It's super simple, like a bias input, you can add and subtract a scalar value from it. You can clamp it if you want. What are you multiplying it against? And then having it run through an exponential node, like adding contrast, like contrast, multiply, and add. And I use that a ton because a texture you have could, work for 75% of everything that you do, but maybe you're like, I want it to be a lot darker with just like a thin strip of white instead of like going in and making a new texture or needing to open up the PSD and adjust that. Like you can just adjust a parameter and have more control over a single texture instead of having 5 different variations of that texture living in your project files.
Travis.
Yes.
Are you ready for the lightning round questions?
I will do my best.
Quick and easy, just like visual effects.
So fast.
What is a perfect one-day getaway in Austin, Texas, and the surrounding area?
Paddleboarding Lady Bird Lake, if the weather is nice enough. It's super calm. There's not really any motorized boat traffic on there because it's kind of like a small contained reservoir. You have like the occasional paddle boat with people taking a tour of Austin, but there's no like jet skis or boats. So super calm because it's kind of in the canyon of this between the buildings of downtown and the kind of ridge on the other side of it. There's not much wind. It's out in the open. You have a great view. It's just surrounded by trees. That's fun. If it's not super crowded, there's a spring-fed pool called Barton Springs. Usually pretty cold, and there's a lot of people there, but it's a really cool place. It's just like a creek that feeds into this concrete pool, and it's super deep, and they have diving boards, and you can lay on this hill, so it's like grass and stuff. You're not just like on bleachers or anything like that like you would be a water park. And it's always a really chill vibe. They're pretty strict on, no glass, no alcohol, no music, so people aren't blasting their music. It's a really, really fun, chill time.
What video game or app are you using on your phone that is the most fun?
On my phone, I guess just Twitter. I wouldn't so much call it fun, but I love scrolling through there and seeing all of the artists that I follow, or finding someone posting a quick tip or a tutorial, and super easy to just be like, hey, favorite, and I'll look at that later when I'm sitting down at my computer. App as a whole, Procreate on my iPad. I'm finding I love that more and more than Photoshop every day. It's not the best for making like tileable noise unless you just want to sit there and hand paint it, but sketching stuff out, doing concepting, even just making textures, I'll sketch up something super fast in there and then bring it into Photoshop and touch it up and then throw that in the game.
What is your favorite thing to cook or eat?
Gotta go with the low bar answer of chicken nuggets, especially if they're dinosaur shaped. I certainly don't eat them all the time. It probably sounds like, every other meal I'm just like throwing chicken nuggets in the oven, but I don't know. It's just one of my go-to favorites. Just ketchup and ranch just on the plate, and you can just sit there eating them while you watch a movie. The dinosaur shape just makes them taste better. Don't know what it is.
That sounds really good. I think I may go get some. What is your favorite book or podcast you've listened to recently?
Recently, I haven't been listening to too many podcasts. I mean, I've cleared through all of the episodes of the Real-Time VFX podcast, so I'm out of episodes there. But I don't know, I've had my head down just working and listening to music to help me stay in the groove. So nothing watched yet.
What's your go-to playlist, your music track? You got something you listen to on repeat?
It could be a song that I found. A lot of the times I'll have my Marshmallow playlist, and I kind of like cherry picked all the songs that have like they have like a really fast beat to them. It's not a lot of like heavy wubs and dubs. I can just have that on repeat, and I don't know. The feel of it keeps me in a good mood, and the rhythm of it is like the perfect background noise that my brain just kind of like syncs to. But if there's some song that like I hear on the radio or like comes up on a random station, I kid you not, I can listen to that just one song on repeat for like 2 or 3 days straight. Like get up in the morning, turn that song, just have like single loop on, and it just plays in the background of my brain all day. One really good book that I've been reading through, the author is one of the people I mentioned earlier, Jocko Willink. The title of it is like Discipline Equals Freedom. And it's not so much self-help book or anything like that of him explaining how to do things, but it's him kind of talking through processes of difficult things he encounters in life or common things that you can encounter, and then basically his thought process on like why that's not an excuse to not keep doing things, like to give in to, when it like, oh, I feel tired, I don't want to go to the gym, or, oh, I don't want to do this aspect of my job. It's kind of structured in a fun way. It's really short. Like each little him talking things out is like a page or two. So it's not like you have to read it start to finish. You can read like a page or two before you go to bed or first thing you wake up in the morning. And you're like, oh yeah, I really don't need to eat that donut. Like there's far better things I can eat. That's just how my brain works. I need to keep reminding myself that stuff, or I'll kind of fall into that like laziness trap, and I'm really bad at it. So that's one of my favorites because it actually keeps me functioning, being productive, and getting better at everything.
Best advice for a first-time visual effects artist or people looking to get into the industry?
Be kind and polite to everyone. you interact with on the internet, especially with working from home and maybe someone who doesn't have the luxury of going to a university or a college where you have a classroom of 30 people to talk to. Social media is a huge thing. Like I have more acquaintances and friends that I've, talked to over Twitter and the forums, over a span of years than I did my graduating class. So be nice to everyone. Again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, just practice animating spheres, like a particle system sphere, size over life, try animating color over life. And that sounds super boring, but it's like that practicing drawing a circle and practicing drawing straight lines for, traditional art. Like, it seems boring, but the amount that pays off to know and have a good feel for those foundational animation principles is humongous. You can always go back and learn materials, and there are so many people who can help you easier understanding how to do something in a material or how to do something in Blueprint or why your thing isn't working, because that's a very 1 + 1 = 2 structured thing. But getting a feel for those more abstract concepts, and again, I know I hated that word when I was starting out, but the feel of things, like starting that experience early on is something I would recommend visual effects artists. We all want to make the next League of Legends ultimate spell ability. We all want to do the biggest, flashiest thing, but I promise you, practicing animation, it applies to realistic effects for things like explosions and buildings crumbling, understanding that weight and gravity and stuff like that. It pays off so much, and it's the secret sauce of what makes effects look good other than having like a really good texture. Yeah, try following as many artists as you can. Oh, a really huge tip that I try and preach to everyone, especially for people or new artists using Twitter, is mute and block anything that stresses you out. Like, you're not a bad person for muting the latest hashtag because there's a disaster somewhere. Like, I know that sounds bad, but if that's going to drain you and stress you out, or turn off likes and retweets for maybe someone who's they post their personal posts are VFX related, but they retweet a lot of stuff where you fall down a rabbit hole. Like, you can turn all that off if you're going to have some kind of social media that's focused on being an artist and using that to kind of meet people and get into game dev. Keep it focused to just that. Make a separate one. Be nice to everyone. I think that's it.
That's great. What question do you never get asked, Travis, that you wish you were asked more often?
What I should focus on when I'm starting out learning VFX, like asking artists if they have like a process or things that they should focus on, and actually like sticking to that. I think it's a great question for all younger people to ask any, more seasoned VFX artists that they know or are acquainted with or have met on Twitter. Like, there's plenty of people who would love to help you. Like, you just have to reach out, and the worst case is they don't respond, or they're like, sorry, I don't have time. And that's one thing to keep in mind with newer artists is this job is incredibly busy, and it may take someone a while to get back to you, or they may click that notification and go, oh, I'll get back to that later, and get lost in their work and never respond. It's not them being rude. Maybe there's a minute percentage of people who are, but a lot of people want to help you, especially getting more VFX artists into games. We want to help. We want to tell you everything that we possibly can. Sometimes, we just forget or we just don't have time. But ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask for help and ask people's opinions and what they wish they had learned when they were starting out.
Rock on. And my last question to you, is there anything you want to plug? Any projects you're working on, or people or things that you just want to share and kind of get the word out?
Nothing
Even
besides
your own
like
mom. Just a shout out to your mom.
Shout out to Mom. Thanks for supporting me when I said I wanted to make video games when I was 7 years old, and also being stern enough to keep me on that path and not just sitting on the couch. Aside from the Real-Time VFX forum, there's a Real-Time VFX Discord channel if people aren't aware of that. That's about it.
Rock on. Travis, again, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Bye-bye now. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode with Travis Henderson. I love this guy. Super happy that I was able to finally get him on the show. He really helped me figure out what the basic needs for a visual effects portfolio were in my own work way back in 2018. So kudos for his contribution to the community as well. I want to let you know that we are constantly looking for new guest artists to put on the show and share their stories. This is a community of learning and sharing. So if there's somebody that you want to recommend that you'd love to hear the voice from, please let me know. I want to get people on this show that are enthralled and enthusiastic about real-time visual effects as I am. Until next time, rock on.